Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. Today we're going to take a look at a Husqvarna 435 chainsaw. The customer complaint is that it just doesn't run right and it doesn't have much power. So the first thing I'm going to do is look into the fuel tank, and I want to see that he's got fresh fuel in there, that there's no water in the fuel tank, and I'm also going to take a look at the filter. So the filter in this case, it's dirty. It should be replaced. And if we move forward with the repair, we'll come back and we will replace that. But first I want to pressure test this fuel line. I'm going to put 10 pounds of pressure on here and see if it holds. And it does. And that tells me that the fuel line, the rubber line, is good. And the carburetor is sealed and tight. And there's no leaks in the carb. We want to look in the cylinder first, though, and determine that this saw is actually going to get repaired before I put a new filter on here. So let's pop the cover off the top. You'll notice when I pop these plastic clips, I always kind of hold them, back them up so they don't go flying. And that'll just save the clip. You know, it's just a plastic hinge on there. So let's look inside this cylinder. Blowing around the base of the spark plug after you break it loose removes any dirt that might fall into the cylinder once the plug's removed. So the cylinder looks good in there. And now I know that this thing's going to get fixed. So we're going to thread a fresh plug in here. And we're going to backtrack now. Now I certainly could just do this in a different order. I could look at the spark plug first, but you got to start somewhere. And if I opened up that fuel tank and it stunk really bad and I knew it was old fuel, you know, that would give me a starting point too. So you can't be everywhere at once, right? You got to start somewhere. So we know we got fresh fuel in here. Now we're gonna probably take a look at this air filter and then try and duplicate the guy's complaint. So the thing's priming up normal. The choke works like it should. I got that sheath on the bar. That's not good. So what happened there? That just wasn't normal. Kind of thinking about what's going on here, and I've got an idea in my head just on that short run. But we gotta dig into a little bit deeper before we commit to this. Alright, I wanted to listen along. Did you notice how far we had to adjust the carburetor just to get the thing to even run close to right? And then we had a big problem with it not wanting to settle down to an idle. And now it's not real consistent. Those are all signs of an air leak. So we're going to start it back up, and we're going to use a little bit of carb cleaner and squirt around and see if we can find that air leak. So the first place I'm going to look is the crank seal here on the clutch side. That doesn't do anything. And then we're spraying around by the base gasket. That doesn't really seem to make a difference. But when we squirt it around the intake boot, it snubbed the motor right out. So we suspect that the intake boot is the source of an air leak. So let's pull this thing apart and take a closer look and see if we can find that air leak. First we're removing the throttle linkage, then we're removing the air filter holder from the rubber saddle that's mounted on the carburetor tray. And now we're going to loosen the screws that hold the carburetor on. On this saw, you gotta take a lot of stuff apart to get a decent shot at that intake boot. Obviously the carburetor's got to come off because it's connected to the boot. So we've got it unbolted. See if we can get that carb or air filter holder out of the way. It's kind of a tight fit in there, but we got it. I'm going to pop a fuel line off the primer bulb. It'll let us move this thing, this air filter holder, out of the way. There's a clip on top of the carburetor right there. We release that clip, and the carb comes out. Look at all that dirt on the bottom. Yikes. Seems like there's been a lot of dirt just living down there underneath the carburetor. I'm sticking my fingers in the holes there to keep the dirt out of the engine, and then just blowing away all that schmutz. Can't visually see anything wrong with the boot, at least not from this angle. So we're going to tear it down a little bit farther and pull that intake boot right off of there. This seems like a lot of work to go through, but I mean, really, it's not. You got to take the handle off. So what's that, 3 screws? And then you got to take everything else off. So what's that, another 10 screws? First the starter. Actually, I'm running through my head how close I am on that 10 count. Might be closer to 12. 4 on the starter. 4 on the holding the cylinder down. 2 on the ignition coil. Oop, forgot about the anti-vibe springs. Might be up to 13 or 14. And the chain brake, cripes. Okay, there's a few more screws than I remembered. But it's still not that big a deal. So whenever you remove a brake handle, you want to pay attention to what's going on the clutch side. And in this case, there's this little spring-loaded plunger. If you were to forget about that, at some point it would definitely come popping out of there, and you'd be looking for it on the shop floor. This is a locating pin for a little buffer. And now we got the fuel tank pried away enough to try and get in here with a Allen socket and break loose these 4 screws that hold the cylinder down to the crankcase bottom half. This is a clamshell design engine, meaning the case doesn't split side to side. The cylinder is just bolted straight down to a crankcase half. And those screws were tight. I just happened to notice looking at this video that the chain guide plate on this saw is all worn too. Needs to be replaced. So now we're pulling the screws out that hold that engine together. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. There's more things that have to come apart for this to actually disassemble. That flywheel is going to have to come off of there. That ignition coil is going to have to come off of there. We're still working on the bolts that hold the engine down. Now the coil's coming off. 2 screws for that. And, you know, this seems like a big gamble, but all the signs point towards an air leak on the intake boot. So we're going to pop this flywheel off. I use those Q-tips just to hold the starter dogs back so I don't hammer them and bend them. But just put a little pressure behind the flywheel and give it a tap. Make sure that you got a nut on there so you don't damage the threads of the crank. Now if you can't get the motor to pull out at this point, you may have to rotate it and get the flyweights of the crankshaft oriented properly. There we go. And then it pops right out. So let's see if we can find a leak on this intake boot. And if we do, that's all I'm going to have for you on the Husqvarna 435 that just didn't run right. Thanks for watching. Later.